the cross and the gavel. The gavel's sharp report shattered the hush, its echo the only sound in the hushed courtroom. Judge Eleanor Thompson, her steely gray hair sculpted into a rigid bun, scanned the room. Her laser focus landed on each figure: the jittery defendant facing a traffic ticket, the jaded public defender, the court reporter's fingers dancing over the keyboard. Precision, order, these were her watchwords. Control, she believed, was the bedrock of justice. Next case, she declared, her voice clipped and businesslike. Docket 2024 CR 047, Municipality of Harmony Creek vs. Clint Eastwood. Ordinance 34B, Section 2, pertaining to overtly displayed religious symbols exceeding 1 inch in diameter within town boundaries. A wave of whispers rolled through the gallery. Clint Eastwood? The iconic Eastwood? What brought him here? He rose, a figure as deeply etched into the cultural landscape as the vistas he'd immortalized. Dressed in a simple charcoal suit, the single point of contrast was a slender silver cross suspended from a delicate chain at his throat. Subdued, almost concealed, it nevertheless made its presence known, and in doing so, violated Ordinance 34B. Judge Thompson's countenance remained impassive. Years spent presiding over defiant defendants had steeled her resolve. She'd witnessed every trick in the book: maudlin appeals, outright falsehoods, thinly veiled threats. None of it had ever swayed her. The law was immutable. Mr. Eastwood. She addressed him, her tone entirely without warmth. Are you cognizant of Ordinance 34B, Section 2, of the Harmony Creek Municipal Code? He offered a slow nod, his gaze, the color of time-worn granite, locked onto hers. I am. And you understand that wearing this cross, she indicated it with her pen, is a breach of said ordinance? Yes, ma'am. His voice, a deep, resonant rumble, carried a weight that filled the chamber, commanding attention without volume. Do you have anything to offer in your defense? She inquired, already anticipating his response. This was mere procedure. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the captivated faces, the rustling murmurs. Returning his gaze to Judge Thompson, a flicker of something indecipherable danced within their depths. With all due respect, Your Honor, I contend that the ordinance is unconstitutional. A collective intake of breaths swept the courtroom. Judge Thompson's eyes sharpened. This was an unexpected deviation. Mr. Eastwood, she said, her voice dangerously even. Are you a member of the bar? No, ma'am. Then I suggest you refrain from making pronouncements on matters of law. The ordinance has been vetted by the town council and found to be entirely within legal bounds. Vetted, perhaps, Eastwood countered, his tone unwavering despite its quietness. But not necessarily just. Judge Thompson leaned forward, knuckles gleaming white as she clutched the gavel. Mr. Eastwood, do you plead guilty or not guilty? He met her stare directly, his expression implacable. I am wearing the cross, Your Honor. I am aware of the ordinance, and I assert my right to wear it. That is not an answer, she snapped. It is the only answer I can offer in good conscience. The silence in the courtroom felt palpable, a tension so thick it could be sliced. Judge Thompson drew a slow breath, struggling to maintain her composure. This man, a legend, was defying her authority, challenging her judgment. She could not allow him to prevail. Mr. Eastwood, she pronounced, her voice regaining its icy edge, I find you in contravention of Ordinance 34B, Section 2. I hereby levy a fine of $500. The words hung, suspended. $500, a trifling sum for a man of his stature, yet a symbolic victory for her. Eastwood gave no outward reaction. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable as ever. Reaching into his pocket, he extracted a thick roll of currency, counted out $500 bills, and placed them on the clerk's desk with measured precision. Turning back to Judge Thompson, his eyes conveyed a profound understanding that seemed, for a fleeting instant, to unsettle her. Wordlessly, he turned and strode from the courtroom, the silver cross catching the light against the dark fabric of his suit. The silence descended once more, heavier now, permeated by an undercurrent of anticipation. Everyone present sensed that this was far from over. This was merely the opening salvo. Judge Thompson watched him depart, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had won, hadn't she? She had upheld the integrity of the law. Yet, a disquieting sense of defeat lingered. The gavel felt cumbersome in her grasp, the weight of her office pressing heavily upon her. The courtroom seemed stifling, the eyes of the gallery boring into her. She needed to reclaim command, to reassert her dominance. But as she surveyed the silent room, she couldn't dispel the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that the very cross she had condemned had cast a dark, ominous shadow over her gavel. Media firestorm. The courtroom doors might as well have been a starting gun. A lone tweet from a courthouse scribe, "Eastwood fined. Cross removal ordered," ignited the digital tinder. It was a trending topic in moments, followed by blaring news alerts, cable news banners snaking across the screen, and radio broadcasts interrupting the daily commute. A jarring collage of voices and visuals descended. On Fox News, an anchor's rigid countenance framed a declaration of violated religious liberties. CNN's talking heads engaged in a verbal tug-of-war over church-state separation, their arguments escalating in a clamorous debate. Hashtag Stand with Clint and hashtag Separation of Church and State battled for supremacy on Twitter. Memes blossomed, Eastwood's iconic scowl melded with the stars and stripes, crucifixes juxtaposed against stern gavels. The internet had become a war zone. Back at the small firm, Sarah felt swamped by the deluge of information flickering on her monitor. Her phone vibrated nonstop. Newshounds, bloggers, even long-lost cousins sought sound bites and explanations. "This is unreal," she murmured, tucking a loose tendril behind her ear. David, the firm's senior partner, known for his sardonic humor, chuckled from across the room. "Unreal doesn't cover it, Sarah. This is a three-ring circus. And you, my dear, are conducting the band." A pit formed in Sarah's stomach. But the fine was minimal. It was about the precedent. Precedent makes headlines, Sarah. Especially when it involves Clint Eastwood and faith. Now remind me about his legal strategy, or lack thereof? David inquired. She recounted the brief, almost bewildering court exchange. He offered no argument, no objections. He simply acknowledged the verdict. Maria, another colleague, leaned back, a pensive expression on her face. "That's strange. Eastwood's nobody's fool. He must have anticipated the repercussions of wearing that cross. And he certainly possesses the means to contest this. Why the silence?" The question lingered, unanswered, until the shrill summons of Sarah's phone cut through the air. She ignored it. Outside Eastwood's Carmel estate, a different pandemonium reigned. News vans choked the road, their satellite dishes resembling metallic brambles. Reporters elbowed for space, extending microphones, desperate for a quote to seize. As Eastwood's car swept through the gates, the throng surged forward. Camera flashes exploded like miniature suns. A chorus of voices clamored. "Mr. Eastwood! Any comment on the ruling, sir? Are you planning an appeal, Mr. Eastwood? What are your thoughts on the public reaction, Mr. Eastwood?" Eastwood remained impassive. His face was a stone mask, his gaze fixed ahead. He drove with glacial slowness, ignoring the shouts and the strobing lights. The only hint of acknowledgement was a subtle clenching of his jaw. The silence he projected was a booming vacuum, intensifying the madness, augmenting every conjecture. Was he defiant? Resigned? Plotting a countermove? Each nuance, each fleeting expression, became fodder for intense scrutiny. Inside the mansion, safe from the intrusive gaze of the world, Eastwood poured himself a glass of water. He approached the window, watching the ocean's relentless assault against the coastline. He took a measured sip. Though the storm raged outside, a profound calm permeated the house. The quiet was his armament, his fortress, his scheme. And no one, not the media, not the courts, not even Sarah Chin, had an inkling of his next move. The lawman's secret. Dust spun in miniature cyclones beyond the bars, mirroring the tempest raging within Clint. Judge Fines, that pompous autocrat, had him cornered. Paying the assessment wasn't the issue. He had funds squirreled away. No, this was about something far more fundamental, the inalienable right of a man to dress as he pleased. He leaned against the chilly stone, fine smug expressions seared into his memory. He needed a strategy. A plan required clear thought, focused and sharp. His mind wandered back, not to some recreated frontier town, but to the sanctums of Stanford Law. He could almost inhale the mingled aromas of aging paper and meticulously maintained wood. The staccato rhythm of keys striking parchment, the muted murmur of spirited debate, long forgotten. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The lecture hall throbbed with subdued anxiety. Constitutional law final. Professor Harding, a man whose pronouncements could shatter crystal and whose intellect could topple regimes, patrolled before the class. Young Clint, then a raw-boned, zealous scholar named Clint Eastwood, occupied the front row, brow deeply etched with concentration. Harding peppered them with questions like buckshot, dissecting pivotal cases, seeking weaknesses in logic. Students stumbled, faltered. But Clint responded with a quiet assurance that belied his youth. He grasped the subtleties, the delicate shifts in legal discourse. He understood the very core of law, the precarious equilibrium between personal freedom and societal order. Following the grueling exam, Harding summoned him to his office. The space was a haven of jurisprudential lore, encased in leather-bound tomes and permeated by the comforting tang of pipe smoke. Eastwood, Harding began, his tone surprisingly warm. Your comprehension of the Fifth Amendment is remarkable. You perceive nuances others overlook. Clint shuffled, discomfited by praise. Just preparation, sir. Harding chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like leaves in autumn. Diligence alone doesn't unlock this level of perception. You possess an innate gift, Eastwood. A legal mind sharper than any I've encountered in decades. You could ascend to the Supreme Court. Clint raked his fingers through his hair. That's generous, Professor. But I'm not sure that's my ambition. Harding's eyebrow arched inquisitively. What other pursuit could possibly satisfy such an intellect? Clint hesitated, gazing through the window at the students congregating on the sunlit quadrangle. He saw them, the future power brokers of law, driven by aspiration, influence, the relentless pursuit of triumph. And he felt a void, a deep current of disquiet. I don't know, sir, he confessed, his voice barely audible. It all feels confining. Too much rhetoric, too little action. Too much manipulation of truth to advance an agenda. Harding exhaled, a plume of aromatic smoke spiraling upwards. The law is a potent instrument, Eastwood. It can be wielded for good or ill. The choice lies with the individual. But what if the system itself is compromised? Clint pressed. What if the law becomes a tool of oppression, a mechanism of control? What recourse remains? Harding fixed him with a prolonged gaze, his expression a blend of melancholy and comprehension. Then, Mr. Eastwood, he responded softly, you must discover an alternative mode of engagement. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The memory dissolved, leaving Clint with a keen stab of remorse. He had relinquished it all. The promise, the prestige, the authority. He'd exchanged legal arguments for screenplays, courtrooms for studios. But had he truly deserted the struggle? Or had he simply selected a different arena? He straightened, the oppressive atmosphere of the cell weighing heavily upon him. He knew precisely what he must do. He might appear a has-been actor in Fine's estimation, but his knowledge of the law remained intact. And he was certain he could deploy it effectively. He approached the bars and shook them, the reverberation echoing throughout the diminutive jailhouse. Guard! He bellowed, his voice vibrating with renewed resolve. I demand to see the judge. Immediately. Digging for dirt. All right, Sarah, let's see what we can find on this ridiculous ordinance, Eastwood said, settling into the worn leather chair in his den. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old books and pipe tobacco. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the cluttered desk. Sarah perched on the edge of a less imposing chair, her notebook open and pen poised. I've already pulled some initial information, Mr. Eastwood. It's Ordinance 23B, commonly referred to as the Public Decency Act. She swallowed, her voice a little tight. It seems broad. Eastwood grunted. Broad enough to drive a truck through, I imagine. That's how these things usually work. He gestured towards the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows on his craggy face. Start with the legislative history. See who sponsored it, what their arguments were. Find the pressure points. Sarah nodded, a determined glint in her eyes. Right. I'll head to the county law library. They have the archived records there. The library was a mausoleum of legal precedent, a cavernous space filled with towering shelves and the hushed rustle of turning pages. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach as she navigated the endless rows, the sheer volume of information threatening to overwhelm her. She focused, reminding herself of Eastwood's calm demeanor, his quiet confidence. She located the relevant section and began sifting through the documents, her fingers tracing the faded ink of handwritten notes and official reports. The deeper she dug, the more uneasy she became. The ordinance had been pushed through with surprising speed, seemingly without proper debate or public input. The arguments in its favor were vague, couched in terms of protecting community values and preventing moral decay. Hours blurred together as Sarah meticulously pieced together the timeline, cross-referencing documents and tracing the connections between individuals involved. She discovered that the ordinance's primary sponsor, Councilman Harold Finch, had a long history of public pronouncements against what he called religious ostentation and unnecessary displays of faith. Back at Eastwood's den, Sarah spread the photocopied documents across the desk, her face illuminated by the warm glow of a single lamp. Eastwood leaned forward, his gaze sharp and focused. Finch, huh? Always figured he was a snake. Eastwood muttered, tapping a finger on Finch's photograph and a faded newspaper clipping. The language is so vague, Mr. Eastwood. It says any public display of attire or ornamentation deemed offensive to community standards is prohibited. Who decides what's offensive? Sarah asked, frustration creeping into her voice. Eastwood picked up a copy of the ordinance, his eyes scanning the text. That's the beauty of it, Sarah. They leave it open to interpretation. Gives them wiggle room to target whoever they want. He paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. Look at this clause here, Section 4, subsection C. Exemptions may be granted, at the discretion of the County Ethics Committee. Sarah reread the section, her brow furrowing. But there's no definition of Ethics Committee anywhere in the document. There's no mention of its composition, its powers, its procedures. Exactly, Eastwood said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. A loophole big enough to fly a B-52 through. It's like they deliberately left it undefined, so they could control who gets a free pass and who doesn't. He stood and walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. This whole thing stinks, Sarah. Smells like they cooked it up in a back room somewhere. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. We're going to dig deeper, Sarah. We're going to find the dirt they tried to bury. Because sometimes, he said, his voice low and gravelly, the dirt is the only thing that can fertilize the truth. Doubt creeps in. The newspaper's front page, dominated by a leering, pixelated image of Clint Eastwood, felt like a personal affront. His granite features, fixed in a stoic gaze, loomed above the headline. Judge Thompson silences religious freedom. Eleanor recoiled, the morning's coffee turning to dregs on her palate. She flung the Gazette onto the heap of its brethren, each journalistic barb a fresh wound. Thompson's travesty. One screamed. Judicial overreach. Another boldly proclaimed. Her fingers massaged her temples, seeking to quell the insistent thrumming behind her eyes. The burden of the city, perhaps even the country, seemed to settle squarely on her shoulders. Legally, she was sound. Her interpretation was fair. But the public's furious response, it was a rogue wave, threatening to pull her under. Later, finding a semblance of peace within the hushed confines of her chambers, Eleanor sought solace in the texts. The afternoon light, fractured by the Venetian blinds, painted zebra stripes across her mahogany desk. A bulwark of legal briefs stood sentinel around her. She drew City Ordinance 17b4, the subject of so much scrutiny, closer. The Public Decency and Aesthetic Harmony Act, they grandly called it. A worthy aim, maybe, but increasingly it felt like a carefully laid snare. She burrowed into its genesis, following its tangled roots back to the City Council's 88 debates. The transcript unveiled a fractured compromise, a patchwork of imprecise wording and nebulous definitions forged in the crucible of political infighting. The original intention, ostensibly, was to tame gaudy commercial displays and preserve the visual integrity of the historic district. Somewhere along the winding path, its scope had swelled, its bite had intensified. A shiver traced the length of her spine. There it lurked, a subtle yet significant phrase. Items reasonably deemed disruptive to the general aesthetic. Reasonably deemed. Subjective. Fluid. A gaping void at the ordinance's core. Had she been blind before? Had her devotion to the letter of the law obscured its inherent frailty? She closed her eyes, picturing Eastwood standing before her on the stand, the simple silver cross catching the light against his dark shirt. He hadn't quibbled over semantics. He hadn't attacked the wording. He'd spoken of belief, of tradition, of the very heart of the city. And she, compelled by her oath to uphold the law, had silenced him. The image of her father surfaced, a man of staunch principle, a man who had ingrained in her that justice transcended mere rules. It was about the people affected. He'd always said, "Eleanor, the law is a tool. Use it wisely, and never forget whom it serves." A sickening lurch threatened to unseat her. Could she have erred? Had she allowed the law's unyielding nature to cloud her judgment, blinding her to a higher truth? The thought acted as a corrosive agent, slowly dissolving her resolve. The shrill buzz of the phone cut through the silence like a knife. It was David. She hesitated, her hand hovering above the receiver. She knew he was worried, fielding endless calls, shouldering the weight of public censure alongside her. "Hey," she managed, her voice thin. "Eleanor," he replied softly. "Are you all right?" She struggled to swallow. "I don't know, David. I don't know." Static crackled on the line, yet she could sense his concern bridging the distance. "Come home," he pleaded. "Let's just talk this through." She yearned to comply. Desperately. But she couldn't. Not yet. A duty remained unfulfilled. An understanding eluded her. The law, in its cold, unwavering insistence, demanded answers. And so, too, did her conscience. The defendant's defense. The flashbulbs were a physical assault. Eastwood, head held high, navigated the gauntlet of reporters outside the courthouse, their shouted questions dissolving into a meaningless roar. He wore the same faded denim jacket, the silver cross gleaming beneath it, a defiant beacon in the storm. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors ahead. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with an energy thick enough to taste. Every seat was occupied, the air heavy with expectation. He spotted Sarah Chin in the gallery, her face pale but determined. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent promise of support. He returned it with the faintest of smiles, a reassurance he hoped she could read. Judge Thompson, her face etched with a weariness that belied her sharp gaze, was already seated. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "You are representing yourself?" "I am, Your Honor," Eastwood replied, his voice calm despite the churning in his gut. He placed a worn leather briefcase on the table and opened it, extracting a stack of dog-eared papers. No fancy suits, no high-priced lawyers. Just him, the ordinance, and the conviction that he was right. He began slowly, deliberately. "Your Honor, the prosecution claims I violated Ordinance 34B, Section 7, the Public Decency and Aesthetic Harmony Act. They claim my wearing a simple cross is a breach of public order and an offense to community aesthetics." He paused, letting the absurdity of the accusation hang in the air. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he continued, his voice gaining strength, This ordinance is not only vague and subjective, but it is a blatant violation of my constitutional rights." He unfolded a copy of the ordinance, pointing to specific passages. "The language is so broad, so open to interpretation, that it effectively allows for arbitrary enforcement. What constitutes aesthetic harmony is entirely in the eye of the beholder. Today it's a cross, tomorrow it could be a turban, a yarmulke, or even a brightly colored shirt." Sarah, in the gallery, subtly pointed to a specific section of the ordinance with her pen, a section Eastwood had initially overlooked. He smoothly incorporated it into his argument. "Furthermore," Eastwood said, his eyes flashing, "this ordinance attempts to regulate not just behavior, but belief. By prohibiting the outward expression of faith, it infringes upon the very core of the First Amendment. It silences not just me, but anyone who dares to express their convictions openly." He cited several landmark Supreme Court cases, demonstrating a surprising familiarity with legal precedent. He dissected the ordinance's wording, exposing its inherent contradictions and ambiguities. He painted a picture of a society where conformity was valued above individuality, where self-expression was stifled in the name of an artificial and imposed harmony. Judge Thompson listened intently, her expression unreadable. The initial confidence that had marked the beginning of the trial seemed to have faded, replaced by a growing unease. She shifted in her seat, her fingers drumming lightly on the bench. Eastwood could sense her discomfort. He pressed his advantage. "This isn't about a piece of metal, Your Honor. It's about the fundamental right to be who you are, to believe what you believe, and to express those beliefs without fear of persecution." He looked directly at Judge Thompson, his gaze unwavering. "If this ordinance is allowed to stand, it will set a dangerous precedent, opening the door to further restrictions on our freedoms." He paused, letting his words sink in. The courtroom was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the ventilation system. He knew he had planted a seed of doubt, a seed of conscience. Now, all he could do was wait and see if it would take root. The cross felt heavier now, a weight of expectation, a symbol of the battle he was fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone in that room, and perhaps beyond. A judge's dilemma. Ms. Davies, the youthful prosecutor, appeared flustered, beads of perspiration dotting her brow. The carefully rehearsed opening, usually delivered with unshakable assurance, faltered and fractured. Before the court was the Public Decency and Aesthetic Harmony Act, the very piece of legislation that had placed Clint Eastwood in the defendant's chair. "Your Honor," she began, dabbing nervously at her face. "The defendant's presentation was undeniably jarring. It offended the established sensibilities of Harmony Square." A wave of suppressed amusement washed over the gallery. Sarah Chin, perched forward, stifled a laugh. She had witnessed how Eastwood's unassuming cross had sparked dialogue, kindled interest. Jarring wasn't the descriptor that sprang to mind, catalytic felt closer to the truth. Judge Thompson, her face a study in neutrality, silenced the stir with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Ms. Davies, confine yourself to the facts and dispense with the hyperbole." Eastwood, who had been a study in stillness, remained composed, his gaze directed toward the stars and stripes hanging listlessly behind the bench. His quietude possessed its own strength, a powerful counterpoint to the prosecution's agitation. Ms. Davies continued, invoking legal precedents that rang increasingly hollow. She invoked community standards, the importance of visual consistency, and the need to respect established norms. Yet, her voice lacked conviction. Her arguments seemed frail against the backdrop of Eastwood's quiet resolve. Finally, her voice dropping to a near inaudible level, she concluded, "Therefore, Your Honor, we contend that the defendant has violated the Public Decency and Aesthetic Harmony Act and should be duly sanctioned." Judge Thompson turned toward the defendant. "Mr. Eastwood, do you wish to present a defense?" Eastwood rose. His words were delivered with the precision of a seasoned orator, his logic honed to a sharp edge, devoid of unnecessary flourishes. "Your Honor, Ms. Davies speaks of harmony, yet true accord cannot be imposed through forced conformity. Harmony flourishes when diversity is celebrated, when individuals are free to express themselves without fear of penalty." He paused, his gaze encompassing the courtroom. "The cross I wear is not merely decoration. It is a symbol of my beliefs, a reflection of my soul. To silence it is to silence a piece of me, to diminish my very being." He then proceeded to highlight the obvious contradictions within the act, the loopholes that permitted garish billboards and blaring neon signs, while forbidding a simple, subtle expression of personal faith. He systematically dismantled the prosecution's claims, revealing their fragile foundations with clinical precision. He conjured a vision of a society where individuality was suppressed, where sameness was prized above all else, a society where the very spirit of liberty was being subtly eroded. "This act," he finished, his voice imbued with understated passion, "is not about preserving harmony. It is about stifling expression. It is about suppressing dissent. It is about paving a path toward authoritarianism, one meticulously placed petunia at a time." Silence descended, heavy and palpable. Even Miss Davies seemed momentarily affected by the force of Eastwood's oratory. Judge Thompson remained still, her expression impenetrable. The only sound was the low drone of the ventilation system. For a protracted moment, she simply fixed her gaze on Eastwood, as if trying to gauge the depth of his conviction. Then, with a sigh that seemed burdened by the weight of responsibility, she spoke. "This court is adjourned," she announced, her tone clipped. "I will deliver my verdict tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. As Judge Thompson stood and departed the courtroom, Sarah caught a glimpse of something. Was it uncertainty, apprehension, or perhaps remorse? Flicker in her eyes. The gavel fell with a decisive thud that resonated in the ensuing quiet, and Sarah knew the fight was far from decided. The legality of the situation was evident, but justice, it seemed, was a far more elusive goal. Justice prevails. Judge Eleanor Thompson adjusted her glasses, the fluorescent courtroom lights glinting off the lenses. A hush had fallen, thick and heavy. Even the incessant cougher in the back row seemed to have been momentarily silenced. She felt the weight of their expectations, their hopes, their anxieties settling upon her shoulders. This wasn't just about Eastwood. It was about the town, about the very principles they claimed to uphold. She cleared her throat, the sound amplified by the microphone. "Mr. Eastwood," she began, her voice firm despite the knot of unease tightening in her stomach. "The prosecution has presented its case, arguing that your attire violated Municipal Ordinance 17b, pertaining to the obstruction of public thoroughfares by religious displays." She paused, the absurdity of the language hanging in the air. She looked directly at Eastwood. He stood ramrod straight, his gaze unwavering, the small silver cross catching a stray beam of light. It seemed to mock her, a silent testament to the power of belief. She shifted uncomfortably. "However," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she delved into the legal rationale she had painstakingly constructed, "this court finds the ordinance, as written and applied in this specific instance, to be problematic." She could feel Mayor Harding's glare burning into the side of her face, but she pressed on. "The prosecution has failed to demonstrate a clear and present danger, or any demonstrable disruption to public order, resulting directly from Mr. Eastwood's wearing of a cross." She took a deep breath. The room was so still, she could hear the whirring of the courtroom's ventilation system. "Furthermore," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "after extensive review of relevant case law, including Cantwell v. Connecticut and Tinker v. Des Moines, this court finds that Municipal Ordinance 17b, as applied, infringes upon Mr. Eastwood's constitutional right to freedom of expression, as guaranteed by the First Amendment." The words hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Eleanor Thompson felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching herself from afar, a puppet controlled by the dictates of the law. "Therefore," she concluded, her voice resonating through the courtroom, "the fine levied against Mr. Eastwood is hereby overturned. Moreover, this court declares Municipal Ordinance 17b to be unconstitutional as it is currently written and applied." A beat of silence, thick and pregnant, followed. Then, the dam broke. A wave of applause erupted, washing over her, deafening in its intensity. Cheers, whistles, and shouts of joy filled the courtroom. Sarah Chin, perched in the gallery, beamed at Eastwood, her face flushed with excitement. Judge Thompson banged her gavel repeatedly, but it was futile. The noise was overwhelming, a cacophony of relief and jubilation. She watched, stunned, as the courtroom dissolved into a scene of unrestrained celebration. Eastwood remained standing, unmoved by the surrounding frenzy. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of stoic calm. But as the applause continued to thunder, a flicker of something, satisfaction? Vindication? Crossed his face. He gave a subtle nod, almost imperceptible, but Eleanor Thompson saw it. The silver cross, bathed in the triumphant light, glinted once more, a silent beacon in the uproar. The courtroom buzz threatened to engulf her. She banged her gavel once, twice, 3 times, each strike louder than the last. The crowd slowly began to quiet, their elation momentarily subdued by the authority of the court. Judge Thompson, despite the victory she had delivered, felt a hollow ache within her. She had upheld the law, yes, but in doing so, she had defied the expectations of her community, perhaps even alienated herself from those she had always considered her allies. The cheers felt tainted. She rose, the heavy black robe swirling around her, a symbol of the very authority she now questioned. "This court is adjourned," she announced, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. She turned and walked swiftly towards her chambers, leaving behind a courtroom still buzzing with excitement, and a town forever changed. Beyond the courtroom, the glare of the television studio lights felt foreign compared to the somber illumination of the courtroom. Clint Eastwood, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, sat across from a seasoned interviewer, his voice steady as he articulated the need for legal reform. "This isn't about me," he stated, meeting the interviewer's gaze. "It's about ensuring that no one else faces the same unjustifiable restrictions on their personal freedoms. We need laws that protect, not persecute." The broadcast cut to a montage of citizens from across the nation, each echoing Eastwood's sentiment. The victory in court had sparked a fire, igniting a national debate about the balance between public order and individual expression. Judge Eleanor Thompson watched the interview from her chambers, a half-empty mug of lukewarm tea growing cold beside her. The phone had been ringing incessantly since the verdict. Some calls were filled with vitriol, accusing her of being soft on crime, of succumbing to the whims of a celebrity. Others offered cautious praise, commending her courage to uphold the Constitution, even in the face of public pressure. She felt a cold knot of unease in her stomach. This wasn't the quiet life she had envisioned when she accepted the bench. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the delicate scales of justice and the precariousness of her own position within the community. The next morning, Eastwood found himself at a small, unassuming coffee shop a few blocks from his hotel. Sarah Chin was already there, a stack of law journals piled high next to her latte. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the warmth in her eyes. "That interview was incredible, Clint," she said, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. "You've really struck a chord. People are listening." Eastwood smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression. "It's thanks to you, Sarah. You saw something in that ordinance that I missed." Sarah waved her hand dismissively. "I just helped articulate what you already knew in your heart. This victory is yours, and the message is so important." They spoke for hours, not about the case specifics, but about their lives, their passions, their hopes for the future. Sarah shared her dreams of establishing a pro bono legal clinic to help underserved communities, and Eastwood listened intently, offering his support and resources. The coffee grew cold, the pastries remained untouched, but a bond was forming, forged in the crucible of the courtroom, strengthened by shared values. Later that afternoon, Eastwood was back on set, the controlled chaos of a film production swirling around him. He stood in costume, waiting for the cameras to roll. As the makeup artist dabbed at his forehead, Eastwood reached inside his shirt and touched the familiar weight of the silver cross hanging around his neck. It felt heavier now, imbued with a new significance. It was no longer just a symbol of faith, but a tangible reminder of the freedom he had fought for, the principles he had defended. The director called, "Action!" and Eastwood stepped into the scene, his movements confident, his gaze unwavering. In the weeks that followed, the legal landscape began to shift. Civil rights organizations, emboldened by Eastwood's victory, filed lawsuits challenging similar ordinances across the country. The courts, forced to confront the constitutionality of these regulations, often cited Thompson's ruling as precedent. The debate raged on, but the tide had turned. The small-town incident had become a national movement, a testament to the enduring power of individual freedom and the unwavering pursuit of justice.